And welcome back. And we are moving into a second conversation for today as we find out more about the establishment of the Northeastern Biological Corridor. We're joined at this time by the CEO in the Ministry of Forestry, Fisheries, the Environment and Sustainable Development, Dr. Percival. And we have Heron Moreno, who is the Executive Director of the Corozal Sustainable Future Initiative, also known as CSFI. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for having us.
So I understand that obviously this has been an effort that has been ongoing for quite some time, which makes it a major achievement for the environmental community. Let's start off by finding out why it was necessary to establish what you consider a biological corridor.
Well, perhaps I can go first with a little bit of background. The concept of the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor extends way back to the 1990s when countries in the region agreed that because of the high rate of deforestation and the 80% loss of natural vegetation in Mesoamerica, that the countries had to do something to establish areas of protection to ensure that wildlife and biodiversity in general is conserved. So Belize subscribed to that concept, and we have ever since established a network of protected areas. And in the area in the north, we have two protected areas, Sartaneja, a shipstern, and Freshwater Creek Forest Reserve. But they're isolated areas. They're separated by at least 20 kilometers or so.
Right.
And so the question then arises of, if you have these two islands being conserved, and around it you have a development for agriculture and other economic purposes, there is then a disconnect that will eventually occur, and these will be isolated islands. So the concept of the corridor basically is to connect these two areas to ensure there is this landscape connection between the different ecosystems from the shoreline into the tropical forest to ensure that you have the resources, the area needed for biological diversity to persist.
Now, you spoke of it in the context of a Mesoamerican approach, which
Right.
means eventually it should be interconnected with the countries that border us.
Absolutely.
Where are we in that effort?
Well, actually, we've made good progress. Belize, Guatemala, and Mexico currently has a tripartite agreement to conserve the biological resources in the northwestern area. There's several agreements ongoing between the three countries to cooperate on things such as sustainable forestry, on community development, and there's actually an agreement in place to conserve this particular area. It's known as the Selva Maya Forest. And there is connection between our forested areas into Guatemala, into the Petén region, the northern Petén region, and then into Mexico. So this is one large forest block that flows into the three countries. So in terms of our contribution, we have, as the three countries in this region, ensure that we have put in place these measures.
And on the western portion, we have Rio Bravo.
Yes.
That's under program of Belize. You say that, and I have to think, if I am to imagine what the South looks like when it comes to deforestation, especially coming in from Guatemala, we know that a lot of the forested areas are under severe threat. Or what is it like in the northwestern portion where these three countries come together?
Well, on the sides of the different on the border in the different countries, there are long established protected areas. Program for Belize, you mentioned, is a good example from the early 1990s. On the Mexican side as well, there's long established protected areas on the Guatemalan side. So conservation efforts there have been quite successful at ensuring that there is this large block of forest, conserving resources in the area to ensure that we have the necessary ecosystem services provided. Now, on the eastern side of Belize, if you take a journey towards the coast, to the Corozal area, the situation is a little bit different. The area has been developed for sugarcane and beans and crops, and there's a large land clearing development at the moment occurring near Newlands.
Right.
And these development, while they produce the economic benefits for the country, I'm talking about this area here. So this is Eastern Corozal. Right? This is the Corozal Bay, and this is Corozal Town is up that
More
side.
that way. That's copper bound.
Yes, and this is Sartaneja.
Yeah.
So this is the Shipstern Nature Reserve, and this is Freshwater Creek. All of this area, as you know, is development for agriculture. And Shipstern and Freshwater Creek were the last two remaining blocks. But there is a natural conduit, a natural passageway that is still very much forested with lagoons and tropical forests and different ecosystems that have been preserved over time. And the reason why it remains forest cover is it's not 100% suitable for agriculture. So the land use, the utilization of this landscape is better earmarked for conservation purposes, for providing the services like rain formation, water retention, and ensuring that there's replenishment of groundwater that benefits these agricultural areas. Right? So it provides irrigation to these areas and provides the cloud formation and the rainfall that is necessary, of course, for agriculture. So it's not that this area is being reserved and being locked up. It's actually providing a service for the landscape around it. That's a really important thing here.
Well, you preempted my question there, because I think we know how much people are looking for beautiful coastlines, and Corozal has a beautiful coastline for further development. And I think that the challenge in always being able to balance between conservation and development is one that will obviously be drawn into question here. What kind of consultations and research has been done to examine whether there's interest in the coastline and how the establishment of this corridor will affect it?
Well, Heron's organization has been working quite heavily in the area, and also I'll let him describe the scope of work that they've been doing.
Sure. Well, we're based in Sarteneja,
Yes.
and we've been there for quite a while now, for almost 30 years. So we've been there managing shipstern for that time. And so one of our concerns has always been trying to maintain a healthy forest system in that area. I think they just showed a clip of another slide, which shows the level of deforestation. One of the interesting things about this corridor is that it really has brought together a lot of private landowners or private initiative. What has made this corridor a little successful is that the key players are not so many, because the lands have always been some of those old estates from a long time ago. And so these lands in that area have been passed from one owner to the other until the Mennonite community has also owned some of this land as well. So our consultations have been limited to dealing with the private landowners in this area and with the Mennonite community as well, that have been developing this area for agricultural purposes. So during the process of establishing this corridor, the consultations were really based on what they saw as benefits as well. How they would be able to offset some of the work they were doing, because there were also a lot of concerns in terms of how could they at least contribute to conservation efforts in that area. I mean, they were aware that there were also impacts that they were having. But it's just history repeating itself again, because it was exactly the same thing that happened back in the 50s, 60s when the sugarcane industry was being developed back in the more northern parts of the district. And so to avoid some of the things that were done at that time, it was important for us then to go into this and to look at them and say, this is the opportunity for us to now start to create a balance. And I think deep down inside, everybody wants to do something that is right,
But going back to Marlene's question in terms of the balance between conservation and development, you said that a lot of private landowners, these estates are passing. So these corridors, as they currently exist, is almost by default. It's not that it's by design that these have been reserved. And so how do you ensure, if they're that important, that they remain, one, and two, agriculture, which is more plant-based, is different from the way I understand the way these corridors work. They're more designed in terms of animals moving from one area to the next and connecting these two islands, as you referred to them. So how do you balance the competition between the flora, which is in terms of the agricultural side of it, and the animals that need to traverse these areas?
Well, the two are intricately linked, when you look at the landscape dynamics of a country like Belize. There is a lot of agricultural crops being grown in this area that require some level of pollination, some level of watering by natural elements like rain, for example. While some farms in this area use irrigation, a lot of the water that is required still falls from the sky. And so areas like this help to generate the transpiration that is needed to feed and to seed rain clouds, right? So that is one. And in terms of the animal population, there is a lot of dependency on the forest resources here by people from nearby communities. So it's not just the farmers again, but there are communities adjacent to this area here that use the area for hunting. And we all love our game meat. So one of the main benefits.
Season.
Yes, exactly, of course. Ah, great, you remember. when they're in season, of course, we love our game meat. And it is something that the communities benefit from wild areas like these, right? To have access to this natural resource. Timber is another good example of what communities use these areas for. And so besides all ecosystem services that is provided to the croplands, you also have this direct livelihood benefits for communities. And in terms of the coastline, this area is still very much private land. The corridor is at least about 5 kilometers away from the coastline.
So there's still room for development.
Well, yes, this entire area is private ownership.
What is the actual classification the corridor will be? Is it what type of protected area is it? Is a no entry zone, no hunting zone?
Right.
I know oftentimes we talk about reserves and their different classifications and rules that go along with them. So let's explain that.
All right. Well, first of all, while the government is committed to environmental conservation and wise use of resources, certainly there is also the need to ensure that communities and the population have access to benefit from these resources. So the general classification for the area as is currently thought out is a biological corridor under the National Protected Area Systems Act, right? This allows for some level of use. But the primary purpose of a biological corridor is exactly as the words connotate, is to ensure that there is an established area that provides connection between two large biological resources, or more than two, right? A bridge in between. So, yes.
No, but it then becomes really what we're looking at is though moving away from site management to what is protected landscape, right? So it then becomes a protected landscape because the new act also provides for that as well.
Explain the difference a little bit more.
Well, landscape looks at a system as opposed to we're kind of moving away from the typical conservation approach in that we've been managing just the very specific sites, a lot of activities happen, like this is just one that. But that in itself brings a totally different dynamics, and I think it also highlights some of the more larger issues that affect a landscape in terms of, we talk about then water security, we talk about land use planning. So when you look at it from a landscape perspective, then you start to tackle larger issues that are more national in scope, right? So that is where it goes, and so the act allows for that as well. So that it becomes a protected landscape. But I think that as we go along in the process and developing it, then we have to look at what are the different uses that are available, that kind of access people have to those things, because it has to be divided as well. Some areas have to be very strict conservation areas. Some may perhaps, for example, the forest reserve, there is some level of exploitation allowed in that area. And so it's really a process of us now having to design exactly how this landscape is going to work. I don't know if you think.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, Heron. It is a first for this country for the designation of an actual biological corridor in an area that is highly developed, right? And the process of going through that is certainly going to be a learning process.
These are the signs of deforestation that you're seeing?
Yeah, these are the farmlands being developed currently, sugarcane, other types of crops, beans, etc.
Yeah, these are mostly the Mennonite farming
These
communities.
are the farms, yeah.
So you have on there where your hand is, that is Little Belize,
Yeah.
and on the right that is Neuland. This is one of the more recent developments.
Okay.
This one.
All right.
And so you're trying to protect the remaining green
the
space in between.
the remaining, and we do actually have evidence of it actually functioning as a corridor, because we've been tracking wildlife in that area over the last few years, and so we've been now seeing the movement, and that is exactly how the wildlife moves. So as a corridor, it does function.
You spoke of it being, some of it being private land. What are the barriers being put in place that perhaps today I am the owner of the property and my child 10 years from now, or even, I sell it to someone else, wants to develop the area? What are the protective mechanisms in place that the establishment of the corridor is a long-term goal and not necessarily just a short-term activity?
Well, for now, ships are also a private protected area. It's also private lands, right? So it's not national lands. It was actually purchased in the late 80s. But there's a mechanism that allows for that to happen, and I believe it's under the Registered Lands Act, where private landowners can make declarations of national trust. So these lands become a national trust. So the ownership then goes back to the country and people of Belize, but then the management is kept by the organization, like in our case.
Okay.
So CSFI manages Shipstone, which is private land, but then it has then declared it a national trust. What happens is that those trusts then are managed for conservation purposes in perpetuity. The only thing that in perpetuity in Belize means 121 years. So it's locked away for 121 years, right? So yeah, so that's a mechanism that exists.
Okay.
I think there's also looking at what other mechanisms can be developed or how we can now look at the new act. And so before they flip that is actually one of the diagrams that shows the movement of a particular individual from one place to the other, just a month apart from each other.
Yeah.
You tag the animals?
We do. We actually, with these ones, we use camera traps to monitor them.
Yeah.
And so each
The
jaguar has a
jaguars
very
take selfies in front of cameras.
yeah. So each jaguar is, you can identify him by his spots because they
yeah.
have very unique spots, right? And so we identify them, or we code them, and then we also well, this guy we call him el viajero, which is Spanish for the traveler, because he's often tracked from one place to the other form. And so yeah.
So it's already being used as a corridor.
It is.
That's what you're saying. What
is.
other wildlife are we talking about that needs this particular space to traverse these two areas?
Well, all the wildlife you can think about, actually. You know, all the different prey species as well. They have a very rich population of warries, you know, of peccaries, and birds, as you had seen in some of the images. So it's really a corridor that is functioning. If you look at that,
Yeah.
I mean, that is basically the only place
There's
they can go right. And so there's different.
That's a coyote?
Fox.
Oh,
It's a
fox.
fox. It's a fox. It's a fox. You know.
There,
Corozal.
Corozal.
this is not a settled science in terms of biological corridors. I was happy to have, there's an online report about biological corridors. I think it is in the western side, northwestern side. Because really and truly what you're doing is you're creating a bridge, but that doesn't mean that animals are going to use that bridge. How much are we investing in a non-exact science? Are we sort of being hopeful and maybe more hope than effectiveness?
Well, if to answer that, I would say you're right. The science of corridors, if you're going to focus on that one function of an area like this, one theoretical function, is a non-exact science. To ensure that you have some sort of conduit for animals to move through, you have to have a healthy population of animals to move through this area. So you have to take it back one step to look at the level of conservation efforts for different species and monitoring efforts to ensure you have a healthy population. There's not overhunting, to ensure that the populations are balanced out, that you have enough prey species to complement your predators within this area. So there's an aspect of management that is required to ensure that the concept of a corridor is actually, fulfilled. Right? So there's a whole lot of science behind it. But the idea behind the corridor, like you said, if there's no animals in that area, then you don't have a corridor. So start with the animals
You're
first.
a little traveler though, so you know that one.
Yeah, but the thing is, it's exactly the same situation with protected areas in general.
Yeah.
I mean, what guarantee there is a protected areas function as work? It's exactly the same thing. You have, like I remember when we used to work out at sea, some people used to say, sometimes you go into the reserve and there's nothing, you go outside and there's everything happening outside. It's exactly the same thing. But we have to start somewhere, right? And it's to put in place something that can function. But it then goes back to management, right? It's how you manage these systems.
So CSFI will officially manage the corridor?
We're prepared to. That is government decision.
What is the,
Well,
government decides.
Currently, there's a partnership between, you mentioned Wild Tracks earlier, CSFI, and the private landowners,
Right.
and international donors as well, that are joining together in this effort. These are some of the logos here of the different agencies and different landowners.
The consortium.
The consortium, we're calling it. So it is a group effort, really and truly. So management and the work in this area will certainly be a group effort. I just remembered something I read on the news yesterday, that a similar type initiative was done in Chile recently, where the government set aside about 9 million hectares of land to preserve the Patagonian landscape. And that is a demonstration that globally governments are recognizing the importance of conserving landscapes as opposed to individual sites. Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was big news. I don't know if you heard it, but it was huge news.
I'm just thinking of why it should be preserved, but yeah. I want to divert into something else here, because I think, you know, when you talk about privately owned land, and now as I read this particular statement here, what was the buy-in when you made this approach to private landowners? We know the Mennonite community are very invested in agriculture, sometimes attempting things that we didn't think of before. What was the buy-in to get them to decide that they will not utilize this space, especially since they're more forward thinkers and looking to grow?
Right. Well, that's a good question, because the thing is that the corridor initiative had actually started off about 20 years ago, and so when that initiative started back then, that area was kind of designated to be a corridor. Since then, right? When that land was then, because it was private land sold over to the Mennonites, to the Neuland Mennonites, a portion of it was required that it be left untouched, and it was actually imposed on them by government as part of their environmental compliance plan. Right, and so they had to leave that there.
Okay.
Right, so they really didn't have much of a choice in terms of having to protect something, which is a really good thing. You know, I mean, it's just fair that you leave a certain percentage for conservation, right? And so once we started to negotiate with them, they realized that, you know what, well, okay, we can't really do much. It's just better to enter into some type of agreement and do something that is right. The other landowner, I think it really was born from them, and they were the most, Balam Jungle, they're the most significant partner there. I mean, having contributed over almost 15,000 acres to this corridor. I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot, right? And I think they've always been wanting to do something else, but for some reason the environment was never right. I don't know. It was really up to them. So, I mean, there really wasn't any buy-in as such. There's no catch to it, and that is what makes it interesting. It's just partners coming together, people really wanting to do this thing, and realizing that there was not much time left for it, understanding that, you know, the rest of it is probably going to go at some point.
And that's my question. In terms of the 2000 report was saying that 67% of northern Belize is still under broadleaf forest cover. That's a massive amount of space. But how long will it stay that way? It must be that when development starts to push in there, as a landowner and as a business entity, if I'm doing timber extraction or if I am doing sugarcane, more is better. And so this basically cuts into my profit margin. I no longer have the incentive to restrict my profit margins because of something which is not immediate on my books. How do you keep this commitment, not only from government, in the long term when development? Because if I could say one other thing, as it stands right now, these landowners might not be ready to develop their estate. So sure, you want it for 121 years, I'll put it for my children's children. But when that time is ready, I don't care if it's in a water catchment area, I don't care if jaguars are passing through, I don't care if God is passing through, I'm going to develop it. How do we have this realistically for the long term?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for us, typically, we don't see it too far, especially 121 years. That's really far for us. We can't
perpetuity.
imagine that. Yeah, it's perpetuity. I mean, perpetuity can mean a lot of things, but in Belize it means 121 years, right? No, but I think what is really important about this is that it has really opened up cooperation with government. I mean, it shows that there's the willingness to be able to talk about the issues and to be able to discuss things and to come up with real concrete strategies, right? No, it's not perfect, obviously, and it's going to continuously evolve. I think we're going to have to talk about that, and in the coming weeks and even in the coming years, we're going to have to put in place very clear strategies on how we maintain this, and then start to ask other questions. Okay, is this enough in terms of the deforestation rate? Is this what we want to do? Do we want to reverse deforestation? I mean, those are the kind of discussions we have to have, right? The partners also have to be engaged. But it has to be very clear in all of our minds where we want to go with all of this and what is really the intention at the end of the day, right? How we keep it, we don't know yet. How we continue to engage people, we still don't know, right? For now, I think it's looking what are the tangible benefits for this system, how we can then engage them in dealing with the other issues, right? And I think that gives substance, but for now, it's opening up the doors to discussion, to collaboration with government, and it shows that there is willingness from both sides. And the environment is right to be able to put in place these strategies, you know?
I want to add one more thing to that in terms of land use. You see, the traditional concept of land use is that we utilize it for human purposes. There is obviously the extension of that in terms of land use for ensuring that there's of course some preservation of the natural world around us, right? So this area, if you consider the land use set aside specifically to ensure that there's a replenishment of water that we use, a replenishment of the biological resources inside it, then that is a land use that one considers as a population as very important. And it may be considered by some elements as in competition with development, but really it's one type of land use such as development.
Is there a way that we can measure value? For somebody like me from the outside, I'm thinking, okay, government is spending some resources, these organizations are spending some resources, these camps are not free, you have a staff. How do we measure the value of having this corridor in financial and real terms?
Well, nobody better to tell you about the cost of conservation than Heron. That is.
Yeah, no, and I think it really ends up, what it ends up being is trying to understand what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day, right? Remember, we are a conservation organization. So for us, this, I mean, is really achieving what we want to achieve, right? We can say that, you know, we're making progress as a conservation organization. But at the end of the day, I think we're also offering a service to government, to this country. By preserving these resources, by maintaining these systems healthy, I mean, that's a value that we see in our work, right? We're also putting in place a system that allows for other activities, for different types of income generation by the communities that are around there. Putting in place a system that can be used for tourism, by creating meaningful employment in that area. Over the last few years, I mean, we've grown from having a staff of 2 people to a team of 32. I mean, those are real meaningful opportunities that are created, but also putting in place a system that we hope can really outlive all of us, you know? So that's the value that we see. But in terms of putting a price on it, I think everybody's talking about that. How do you do that? How do you value?
Process.
Yeah, but it's not going to happen like now. It'll take some time.
Well, one other point to add in there before we move on is the fact that besides the commitment from private landowners in this area for the purposes of utilizing this area for conservation, the government is also committing 8,000 acres of land to this corridor as well.
Putting the money where their mouth is, putting the land where their mouth is.
But one last thing for me is, remember, we're also going through the process in that, you know, the laws have been revised so that it allows for private protected areas. Part of establishing private protected areas is also going to involve looking at what are the incentives as well for people that want to do that. We're still not quite at that stage yet, but at least there's a framework for it for now. Well, not framework, but at least there's a mechanism for it. We're yet to develop the framework, and not we, but government.
We believe. Yeah.
We believe, yes.
It's a partnership effort.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for coming in and
Thank you too.
educating us on the establishment, the official establishment, technically, of the Northeastern Biological Corridor. And best of luck.
Thank you very much
for having us.
Thank you.
very much for having us.
We're going to go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, you are going to meet the winner of or Dare to Jump sweepstakes. He has a very interesting story as to why he wanted to take that jump, and you're going to find out after the break.